Hello everyone and welcome to my Coronation Street official today, the channel where every gut punch moment, every simmering tension and every character defining breakdown gets the full honest conversation it deserves. Today we are diving into one of the most explosive sequences this show has delivered in a long time. And I promise you, by the end of this video you are going to see the storyline in a completely different light. Weatherfield has always been a street that carries its drama in layers, quiet tensions beneath polite smiles, old wounds reopened by a single wrong word. But what played out in this latest chapter hit with a force that felt genuinely different. Two separate confrontations simmering for weeks beneath the surface erupted at almost exactly the same moment, and the show wove them together in a way that made the whole experience feel suffocating, urgent, and impossible to look away from. On one side, Theo, a man who has spent a great deal of time hiding behind a mask of cool, calculated control, finally shattered in the most alarming way imaginable, his behavior escalating from psychological pressure into something far more physically threatening. And on the other side, Sarah, worn down by weeks of unresolved tension with Danielle, reached her own heartbreaking point in a confrontation that turned raw, emotional, and ultimately physical. These were not just arguments, these were reckonings, long overdue, painfully inevitable, and devastating in their fallout. And all of Weatherfield was caught in the middle. Let us start with Theo because I genuinely cannot stress enough how long this was brewing. Looking back through recent episodes, the signals were everywhere. His temper flashing just a little too quickly in situations where a more composed person would have walked away, his words carrying a sharpened edge that felt calculated and deliberate, his emotional responses becoming shorter, tighter, and harder to read. He presented himself as someone in control, and for a long time, that facade held, but there is a particular kind of danger in a person who suppresses everything beneath a polished exterior. Because when that exterior finally gives way, what comes out underneath is rarely small or manageable. And that is exactly what happened here. Whatever it was that served as the final trigger, Theo's response was seismic. I can't believe it went this far. But honestly, part of me isn't surprised at all. This was no longer about manipulation or quiet intimidation tactics. This was open, physical aggression, the kind of behavior that changes the entire temperature of a room and makes it instantly clear that the situation has crossed into territory that cannot be walked back. Watching him lose control so completely was genuinely unsettling, because it didn't just reveal a new side of his character, it recontextualized everything we thought we already knew about him. Every interaction, every cool response, every carefully controlled moment suddenly looks different when you understand what was always living just beneath the surface. And then there is Sarah, whose own unraveling was happening in a completely separate space but with equal intensity. Imagine carrying that kind of emotional weight for that long weeks of swallowed frustration, unresolved grievances, and mounting mistrust building up with no healthy outlet and no clear resolution in sight. The tension between Sarah and Danielle didn't appear overnight. It was constructed slowly, piece by piece, through misunderstandings left to fester and emotions left unaddressed until they had nowhere else to go. So, when the confrontation finally arrived, there was no warm up, no gradual escalation, it was immediate and overwhelming and soaked in every unspoken thing that had been sitting between them for far too long. The argument peeled back layers with every exchange, revealing not just the surface disagreement but the deeper currents of betrayal, disappointments, and desperate self justification underneath. And when it tipped into something physical, it landed like a gut punch. Not because anyone watching necessarily expected Sarah to remain perfectly composed, but because seeing someone you have followed for so long cross that line forces you to reckon with how thin the boundary really is. Between composure and collapse, imagine how she must have felt in that moment. The release of it, the horror of it, all tangled together in real time with no way to undo any of it. What elevated this whole sequence from dramatic television to genuinely great storytelling was the decision to intercut between both confrontations as they escalated in parallel. Every time the camera pulled away from Theo's terrifying loss of control and landed back on Sarah and Daniel's crumbling argument, the tension multiplied. Every time it cut back, the dread had deepened a little farther. The two storylines were feeding directly into each other rhythmically, each one amplifying the stakes of the other until the whole thing felt like a pressure cooker with no release valve. And caught squarely in the middle of all of it was Danielle. I felt so much watching her in the scenes. She was confused and frightened and visibly overwhelmed by a situation that had been shaped by forces far bigger than anything she had created on her own. Her vulnerability in those moments gave the entire sequence its most human dimension, transforming what could have been a straightforward dramatic confrontation into something that actually aged a little because you were watching someone absorb damage that wasn't entirely hers to carry. The bystanders, drawn into the chaos, added yet another layer of painful realism. People stepping in, trying to calm things down, attempting to de-escalate, and in doing so, sometimes making everything more complicated simply by being present. That is so painfully true to how conflict actually works in tight-knit communities. Nobody is ever fully outside of it, and the performances throughout these scenes were extraordinary across the board. The barely contained fury radiating from Theo, the fierce fractured determination in Sarah that made her terrifying and heartbreaking at the same time, and Daniel's mounting unspoken fear that quietly anchored the emotional weight of everything happening around her. These were performances that earned every second of the drama they were given. Once the immediate chaos finally burned itself out and the silence settled in, what was left behind told its own story. One just as devastating as the confrontation itself, Theo's outburst did not just expose the darker side of his character. It fundamentally reframed the way we have to look at everything that came before it. The quiet manipulation, the measured control, the psychological edge he always maintained, all of it shifts in meaning when you understand what was always simmering underneath. And now the questions are unavoidable. Was this a singular explosion brought on by a unique set of pressures, or is it the beginning of a pattern? Something that grows more dangerous and more erratic as the story continues, because the people around Theo cannot unsee what they witnessed. They cannot pretend it didn't happen or quietly absorb it into a more comfortable version of events. This changed things permanently, and the consequences of that are going to ripple forward through every interaction he has from this point on. For Sarah, the aftermath carries an equally uncomfortable weight. Her confrontation with Daniel was not something that happened to her, it was something she participated in fully, and the reckoning that follows is unavoidable. Can she look at her own behavior honestly, without flinching away from what it reveals about her emotional state and her limits? Or will the pull toward justification, toward redirecting blame and softening the edges of her own actions, prove too strong to resist? That question sits at the heart of her arc going forward, and the way she chooses to answer it will define a great deal of who she is in the chapters ahead. Danielle, meanwhile, finds herself repositioned by these events in ways that no one could have entirely predicted. What began as a relatively peripheral presence has now shifted into something far more central, and the choices she makes in the wake of everything that happened carry real weight, not just for her own story, but for the alliances and fault lines that are quietly reshaping themselves across the entire community. And then there is Weatherfield itself, places like this, small, interconnected, where everyone knows everyone and nothing truly stays private. Do not absorb events like this quietly. They process them collectively, loudly, and imperfectly. People talk, sides get taken, old loyalties are tested and sometimes broken. The ripple effects of what happened are already in motion, and they are not going to resolve themselves cleanly or quickly. This is the kind of storyline whose impact is measured not just in immediate dramatic beats, but in the slow, sustained way it reshapes the landscape of the show for months to come. Personally, I think this is where the story becomes even more powerful, not in the explosion itself, but in what it reveals about each character's limits, and how thin the line is between control and collapse, especially for someone like Theo. What really lingers after this chaos isn't just the shock, it's the uncomfortable truth it exposes about how quickly people can lose control when emotions go unchecked. And that's the part that quietly hits hardest. Because if you look closely, this wasn't just about anger, it was about pressure building in silence for far too long. And the moment no one stepped in, everything cracked at once, leaving damage that won't fade overnight. The beginning of something even darker. At the same time, can Sarah truly face what her actions say about her own emotional breaking point? Or will she try to justify it and push the blame elsewhere? And then there's Danielle, quietly at the center of it all. But could her next move change everything in ways no one expects? Looking ahead, it feels like this isn't the end of the storm. Is the clay calm before something even more unpredictable? Because when trust is broken this deeply, it doesn't just heal, it shapes alliances and creates new tensions that are ready to explode again.